So welcome everybody. Let's start the sixth webinar of the MAIA project. And as you recall, the first webinar was an introduction to ecosystem accounting, and then we had 4 webinars dealing with the core accounts, so extent, condition, services, and valuation. And now we have the 6th webinar, and we are starting talking about the thematic accounts. And most of you, I'm sure, will have heard that about 1 week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago already, the SEEA, parts of the SEEA ecosystem accounting were elevated to the level of a statistical standard. That's really a very big thing, because it means that representatives of all the statistical agencies in the world that come together in the UN Statistics Commission, that they accepted the quality and the thinking behind the ecosystem accounting methodology. And it will definitely mean a lot more interest in ecosystem accounting in the future, both from, especially from statistical offices, because as soon as something is a standard, then there's a lot more confidence that this is an acceptable methodology to follow and to inform policymakers. So I really expect that things will take off from here even more than they did in the last 10 years since we started this process. So it was really wonderful news. So what was not yet accepted as a statistical standard was the monetary part of the ecosystem accounting methodology. It's the physical part, and not the thematic accounts either yet. But still, ecosystem accounting, extent, condition, and physical ecosystem services. There is now going to be a lot more work and a lot more resources going to be available across the world, I think, to do this kind of work. And I think it's really important, because we do need that, because I think we all share, or most of us, I think, will agree that we still lack a lot of information on how ecosystems change and what the societal implications of these changes are. But this is a really big step forward. And at the same time, I think it also poses quite a big challenge for us now as researchers and practitioners, because in reality, when we look at the methodologies for modeling ecosystem services or condition, there's still a lot of choices, right? And of course, in some stages, we have to adjust to the biophysical reality of the countries that we're working in and data availability, etc. But still, I think that there's an urgent need now even more to come up with really good accounts. And in that context, of course, we've been organizing these webinars for the MAIA project. Now, let's talk a little bit about the thematic accounts. So in the previous ecosystem accounting framework, there were 4 thematic accounts, and they were land, carbon, biodiversity, and water. And in the last version of the SEEA ecosystem accounting, they're different. There are some differences, because there's still 4 thematic accounts, but these are carbon, biodiversity, so they're the same, and oceans and urban. So land and water were taken out, and in a way it's also logical to do so, because land is covered mostly in the extent account, and so there was not really a need for the land account anymore. Now that we got more experience with extent accounting, and water actually is also part of the central framework already, and then the SEEA central framework, and then much of the information on hydrological ecosystem services is already in the ecosystem services account. So that was the thinking behind it. And at the same time, we realized that, there was more work needed, and urban and oceans were so important that they would deserve a specific account. So now we have the 4 thematic accounts of carbon, biodiversity, oceans, and urban. And for each of these 4, the MAIA project will also organize a webinar. So we are already attuned to the new SEEA ecosystem accounting standard. So biodiversity accounting is the first one, and I think it's also really a challenging account to produce, because biodiversity is as a concept is already really complex. We all know that it is diversity, but somehow it's also a stock of species, of ecosystems, of genetic information that we have. There's so many indicators that we can use, and unfortunately, what we see that if we use indicators based on birds, we get really quite different results than if we map things or analyze things based on indicators for plant species or for insects, or different groups of insects. So how to choose from that enormous complex amount of interactions between species and presence of species, abundance and richness of species, and of course also where are the data coming from? Because getting data on mammals perhaps it's feasible in many countries, even though if you go to remote areas and tropical forest, even that is hard. But if you talk about insects, then it's already a different story. But to cover biodiversity well, you need a lot of data. Often data are only partially available. And then the question is, well, the data that I have, do they give a good representation of the biodiversity that I actually have or not? What would be the effect of including all those other species for which we don't have data? So I think, and then another question is that, okay, how to communicate the results of biodiversity accounts, how to aggregate that, and how to communicate that to policymakers, because we would see typically different trends in different species groups. So do we give a prevalence to maybe to endemic species or to rare or threatened species? Well, those are all options on the table. And I think we are not yet at the level we can say that we have standardized that. So, well, for sure, in this webinar, we will at least contribute to the development of those biodiversity accounts. And then let me also say that I think that these biodiversity accounts are really, really critically important, because with all the other accounts, we are measuring use values, right? And of how do people use ecosystems. And of course, the criticism that we often get, or the comments that we often get is, but how about intrinsic values of ecosystems? And of course, we're not measuring intrinsic values in ecosystem accounting. But at the same time, the biodiversity accounts at least tells us something about the non-use values of ecosystems. And therefore, having that information on biodiversity is really crucial if we want to kind of inform decision-making on ecosystems. So in my mind, biodiversity accounts are on the one hand very complex to produce, and on the other hand, they're really essential to kind of balance that perspective of monetary values that we produce with the other accounts. So that's kind of my perspective on things. So I'm really looking forward to the presentations by the three people that we have here in the virtual room. So Stephen King from UNEP WCMC will start, and Stephen has been really closely involved in developing the biodiversity guidance in the context of the UN coordinated ecosystem accounting program. And Steve has also done case studies in, well, at least in Uganda, and I'm sure many more places that I'm not aware of. And of course, with WCMC, there is already a wealth of knowledge on species and biodiversity that is extremely important for developing the biodiversity accounts. So only 20 minutes for the presentation. I think you probably could talk about the whole day, but let's see in 20 minutes. And then Simon Jacobsen from NINA. I don't know Simon personally, I have to admit, but the NINA for sure has worked on the Norwegian index for nature, which is, I think, one of the most advanced and most established ways of producing an index for an aggregated index for biodiversity. I think it's very neat the way this index is constructed with grouping biodiversity in species groups and kind of weighing between these species groups. So it was the Norwegian index for nature was developed, I think, before ecosystem accounting started, and now we're kind of trying to understand what lessons we can draw from that effort to also enhance our biodiversity accounting in the context of the SEEA. And then Patrick, with whom I've had the pleasure of working for quite a while now, he's from CBS, the Netherlands, and he did some wonderful work on mapping and analyzing biodiversity in the Netherlands, and for the purpose of biodiversity accounting. So I'm sure these will all be really great presentations. And as I was expecting, I didn't need the full 15 minutes. I think it's also better to actually listen to the speakers themselves. So I think I'll stop here. And Stephen, the floor is yours. And yeah, as I said, I really look forward to the presentations today.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my screen. Yes?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, we can
Perfect.
see it.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. My name's Steve King. Thank you for the introduction, Lars, and welcome to this presentation on thematic accounting for biodiversity and its links to the economy. So really, in this presentation, I think I'm trying to give a fairly broad overview of how we can use a thematic accounting approach to inform development planning and decision making around issues that are going to involve biodiversity, and I think we'll get a lot more detail on the types of measurement approaches from the presentations by Simon and Patrick. But essentially, the way the presentation is going to be structured is first we'll reflect on some of the key concepts and treatments of biodiversity in the SEEA ecosystem accounting framework, and particularly this subchapter on accounting for biodiversity, subchapter 13.3. We'll then introduce the structure proposed for accounting for species in this subsection, and all of this is really, I think, kind of leading us towards how we can build a set of relevant accounts, so coherent and integrated accounts that are really going to help inform on the links between biodiversity and the economy and support this decision-making process that we hope is ultimately going to lead us to a better outcome for biodiversity and people. I think it'll be a bit rushed, but just at the end, I just want to make some final reflections on how one might start to structurally account for informing on biological diversity. So really looking at diversity between ecosystems, not just within them, which is a bit of a gap, I think, in the framework at the moment. Okay, so let's have a look at biodiversity in the SEEA ecosystem accounting framework and how it's treated. I'm sure most of you appreciate that the SEEA EA adopts the CBD definition of biodiversity. So biological diversity means the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So good just to get the definition out there and up front, but we note here and underline the emphasis of variability in that definition, and also the different components of biodiversity definition encompasses. And I just want to return to that idea of variability at the end of the presentation. But for now, let's have a look at these different components of biodiversity that's identified in that CBD definition. I think it's important to really stress that it's the interactions between these different components of biodiversity, and of course the specific entities that make up these components that really underpin and drive the supply of ecosystem services. So maintaining and enhancing biodiversity across all these components and across scale, so not just the local diversity within ecosystem assets, but the arrangement of ecosystem assets and species assemblages in the landscape is going to be crucial for really ensuring long-term maintenance of ecological functions, and in turn underpinning, long-term supply of ecosystem services both now and into the future. So the SEEA EA is clearly well placed to inform on the ecosystem level part of biodiversity, but in this subsection 13.3, accounting for the other components starts to get introduced. And some practical approaches for accounting for species and species habitat are set out, and we'll look at those shortly. Accounting for genetic level biodiversity is highlighted in the subsection, but I think that really is an area for research that will hopefully get progressed as the SEEA EA gets more widely implemented. So ultimately, what we're really interested in is using the information in the SEEA to improve decision making, essentially to help support this integrated development planning approach that's going to deliver our better outcomes for biodiversity. And so within the subchapter on accounting for biodiversity, there's this table provided of established SEEA accounts and associated aggregates and indicators. that really highlights their relevance to informing decision making around issues involving biodiversity. And just looking at the top row here, we see, you know, how trends in from the ecosystem extent accounts can be used to inform what's happening to ecosystems important for biodiversity, and these can be linked to implications for habitat loss and impact on species, and of course the associated benefits that come with them. Obviously, it's an important role for the ecosystem condition account, and I think we'll get some more insight from Simon on how biodiversity can be represented in the condition accounts and the types of signals that could emerge from those. And this table is just an extract. There's a fuller table within the subchapter that starts to also look at the relevant central framework counts and system of national accounts. It's not meant to be comprehensive, it's meant to be indicative, but the idea is, I think, ultimately we're interested in organising a set of the most relevant accounts that's really going to give us the key information we need for decision making, so that we can have this more integrated and holistic approach to development that better considers the decisions that we make and the impacts that they have on biodiversity, whether they be positive or negative. So I also wanted to reflect really on some of the thematic principles that could underpin approaches for accounting for biodiversity. So one of the ones that's highlighted is really around geographical scope, so focusing on targeted ecosystem accounting areas where biodiversity is a particular management or policy concern. Protected areas is an obvious one here, and this is something that we're looking into at the moment as potentially part of the work we're doing. We'd be very interested to hear from anyone in the MAIA project that's doing any work on applying the SEEA EA for protected areas specifically. Please do get in touch. And so the other idea is really looking at more accounting entities, so accounting for more bits of the components of biodiversity, if you like, and species is a very relevant one here, and we'll get into that in the next section. And again, this idea of relevant accounts, essentially picking the accounts, picking the set of indicators and aggregates that can really tell us an interesting and coherent story that can support decision making and planning. And I think this is particularly relevant in the case of biodiversity, where we're going to have multiple environmental and economic stakeholders, all with different objectives that impact and with respect to biodiversity. And so we can use these accounts to start to explore some of the synergies and trade-offs that emerge with our decision making with respect to impacts on biodiversity and economic development. I think that's one of the key ambitions of thematic accounting for biodiversity. Okay, so over these next couple of slides, just really wanted to introduce the structure for the species accounts that's set out in the SEEA EA. And the obvious objective for these accounts is really to more fully integrate this component of biodiversity into decision making. So the idea is that species accounts will be structured to provide information on species abundance, distribution, and/or conservation status over time. And this logic of accounting for species for provisioning services especially is pretty well established via the SEEA central framework, but the ecosystem accounting perspective allows us also the opportunity to consider species in their roles in regulating and cultural ecosystem services. And this really links back, I think, again to some of the points Lars was making around non-use values, and we now have this idea of ecosystem and species appreciation services where these accounts, I think, are very, very relevant. And the scale for organising species accounting is not necessarily at the ecosystem asset scale anymore. Instead, a more flexible approach is proposed where these accounts might be compiled for entire ecosystem accounting areas or ecosystem types within ecosystem accounting areas. and some ideas around how one might start constructing species accounts for the SEEA EA are set out in this publication we coordinated back in 2016, which a number of people on the call today contributed to. So many thanks for that. Okay, so let's have a look at the structure for the species account here. This is table 13.1 in the framework. And so the columns here organize information on selected species. So it could be lions, elephants, what have you, or it could be species groups, so taxonomic groups, for instance, or functional groups such as pollinators. And here we see the different units of measurement might be used, and this will depend on the kind of data that you have available, but they could include information on species abundance, so from surveys, for example, or monitoring programs, information on distribution, so the extent of suitable habitat within ranges of occupancy for a species, for example, or on status and extinction risk, are looking at transitions, say, between red list categories, and these are all over an accounting period. You know, we see here really the classic asset account structure with an opening measure and a closing measure, and where possible, it'd be great to be able to record the additions and reductions to those measures and their nature. Although one appreciates this is a big ask for data, but natural could be, of course, population growth. Managed could be catching or harvesting. So, for example, fisheries harvesting and sorry, no, that would be a reduction. Sorry, managed additions could be species reintroductions and translocations, and reductions could be harvesting or catching of species. And the idea is it's anticipated that these accounts will be compiled using existing data, so existing biodiversity monitoring programs, really. And I think we see good examples of this in the upcoming presentations. Given, I think Patrick's going to provide some examples for the Netherlands based on these abundance-based approach, I thought I'd present just a couple of examples here using the other types of approaches. So this bottom one is an example from the Central Highlands area in Victoria and Australia, based on tracking trends in threat status categories over time. And you generally see that the group of species within this ecosystem area generally becomes more threatened over time, with these net increases in each of the different threat status categories. So this is really informing on the importance of that ecosystem accounting area for statewide conservation of species. The second example is based on accounting for species distribution or suitable habitat in Uganda, using the example of sheer butternut trees. And the idea of this is to really link natural ecosystems that are remaining to species and inform on potential conservation and development opportunities. So where could we promote sustainable harvesting of sheer butternut, for example, as a way of conserving natural ecosystems, adding value chains around that, and creating some kind of stewardship motivation for those areas in Uganda. So here at the sort of like the back end of the presentation, I just wanted to reflect really on this paper that we'd brought together under the MAIA project. It's open access, and here's the link to it. Provides a bit more detail on those two examples just presented there. And it's about really trying to build a coherent picture of the links between biodiversity and the economy. And the key purpose of this paper is really to highlight how different accounts can be brought together and integrated to help build this picture. So this slide was very central to the ideas some of the ideas we're trying to present in the paper, and we'll take just a little bit of time to talk through it. So really, as an information system, the SEEA allows the links between different components of biodiversity, ecosystem services supply and use, and economic units and their economic activities to be communicated to decision makers. And what this figure is trying to do is essentially extend the core biophysical model of the SEEA ecosystem accounting framework by including the species accounts as an explicit component in the model. So arrow A here is really trying to communicate this obviously very strong link between species accounts and ecosystem extent and condition accounts, reflecting that species are the biotic components of ecosystems. They're important for maintaining the functions of ecosystems, but of course ecosystems are essential for species to have somewhere to live. And that was the approach that was adopted really for the species accounts produced for Uganda. But then getting onto the links to the economy, we introduced this arrow B into the ecosystem service accounts. And this was really to represent the flows of final ecosystem services that have direct links to species like harvested wild plants, fish, iconic species for tourism. Arrow C here is really the core pathway of the ecosystem accounting framework, where ecosystem assets underpin the supply of ecosystem services which are used by economic units. But we introduced this arrow B1 links through here to really highlight those species that have a close link to the supply of intermediate ecosystem services, so in the SEEA sense. So pollinators are an example of this. You have a species that provides a service to from one ecosystem to another ecosystem, an agricultural ecosystem, that then goes on to produce a final ecosystem service, such as crop provisioning. And so the idea with this framing is that essentially ecosystem service accounts allow the ecosystem service related benefits economic units get to be linked back to the different components of biodiversity underpinning their supply. And in this way, we can make the economic case for sustainable management and investment in different components of biodiversity. And arrows E and F are really trying to represent that. Arrow E are the negative impacts, such as emissions, over-harvesting of species, conversion of species habitat for different land uses, and many of these impacts can be quantified using the SEEA ecosystem essential framework accounts. Arrow F is meant to be the more positive stuff. So, for example, investments in ecosystem restoration, conservation, etc. That argument for investing in our biodiversity-related natural capital stocks, really. And in theory, these type of investments could be obtained from suitably structured environmental protection expenditure accounts in the SEEA framework. But I must admit, I've not seen any examples to date, though I know there's work ongoing in that regard. So in summary, really the sense this figure is trying to communicate is that developing a set of accounts can quantify all these links between biodiversity and the economy, and the common classifications, concepts and measurement boundaries of the national accounting system then mean this information is organized in a way that is comparable and can inform a more holistic planning approaches, for example, across policies, across sectors, across ecosystems, across social development objectives. And so in this way, we can really get at the trade-offs and synergies between biodiversity enhancement and economic development and communicate these to decision makers. So just reflecting on some of these insights that we can provide from this integrated set of accounts, we can reveal ecological and ecosystem service returns associated with expenditure on biodiversity. We can understand biodiversity conservation in terms of opportunity costs, so not proceeding with timber harvesting in an old growth forest, for example. And a key point is really revealing the multiple benefits of biodiversity for different objectives, whether it be broad nature-based solutions, investing in ecosystem-based adaptation, or investing in ecosystems to achieve climate change mitigation. Oops, sorry. And by presenting this information on species, ecosystems and associated ecosystem services together, we can potentially use this to inform on social objectives. So employment in biodiversity related sectors, for example, tourism and the fisheries subsector, and investing in the natural resource base that can support that. And again, for poverty incidents, we can use these accounts potentially to inform investment levels in promoting ecosystem-based livelihoods. And ultimately, we're looking at really mainstreaming the values of biodiversity into economic planning through this type of approach. So this is a type of planning that obviously recognises the multiple benefit biodiversity provides and allows us potentially then to share investment and management costs and mitigate economic impacts on biodiversity sort of across sectors rather than taking it on a sector by sector perspective. So that was really, I think, the sort of key objective of the presentation was to communicate that kind of integrated planning approach and the importance of bringing together the right accounts in thematic biodiversity for decision making around biodiversity and development. I just at the end wanted to finally reflect on that CBD emphasis on variability or diversity. So the ecosystem condition account for species diversity, say within ecosystem assets, is set out really in chapter 5, but we don't really see an account emerge for diversity between ecosystem assets or species assemblages, for example, at ecosystem accounting areas or landscape scale. As we touched on earlier in the presentation, it's really how all these different components of biodiversity interact across scales that underpins both current and future ecosystem service supply. So understanding this is going to be important if we want to achieve multifunctional and resilient landscapes, if we want to maintain the capacity of our ecosystem assets for ecosystem service supply, because there's a lot of intermediate ecosystem services happening. And it's going to be important for maintaining our future options with respect to ecosystem services. And so again, these are some of the ideas that we explore in the paper produced under the MAIA project in section 3.2. An example of an accounting approach is presented for Peru. And I just wanted to quickly put up this figure. I won't go into the details, but this was presented at the expert forum by Simon Ferrier from CSIRO in Australia, and the link to his slides there. But it was really a schematic and some ideas on how one could draw on the ecosystem extent and condition accounts and species accounts to start to develop what would be an account of diversity sort of within species, between species, and across ecosystems. So getting back to maybe some of those variability parts of the CBD definition. And I think this will be an important area to look at as, again, experience and with applying the SEEA begins to build. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you all very much for your attention. I look forward to participating in the panel.
Thanks. I'm Simon Jakobsson, representing MAIA, Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. And I present quite a brief overview of the Norwegian Nature Index, which was introduced by Lars earlier. So, Norwegian Nature Index is a index that aggregates a set of biodiversity indicators into either an overall index or a specific thematic indices. It's based on mainly on population levels of species and all species groups, and a few indirect indicators. So it's basically based on species abundances together. These species or indicators form a representative selection of the native species for 7 main ecosystems in Norway, listed here. And the main, the key concept of the Nature nature index is that all data are related to a defined reference condition for all ecosystems related to theoretical intact nature with negligible human impact and given the climate and these percentages or biodiversity that could have been found in a reference context within the climate normal period. This intact nature is also applied on more semi-natural systems, where it's considered an ecosystem that is under good appropriate management, but with negligible other human impact. The work behind the Norwegian Nature Index started already before 2010. It has and still involves a large number of experts across the ecosystems. Researchers. It's been updated 3 times since then, or presented 3 times, 5th year. And for each update, the data or the index has been updated also back in time. So it's based on our best available knowledge practice. So if knowledge and data has been improved, then the index is updated also back in time. Being an index, it's quite complicated, calculations and so on. I will give you a brief overview of the methodological approach here. Data that feed into Nature Index is based on a mix of monitoring data, model data, and expert assessments. Of course, these are kind of overlapping. Expert assessment without some kind of data behind it, and the model data is usually based on monitoring data, of course. But in terms of presenting the data behind the index, we usually group them, the indicators, in these 3 categories. I will show you a few examples concerning how the data is presented last update Nature Index last year. And here you can see, for example, that the Nature Index for coastal waters is mainly relying on monitoring data, whereas expert assessments form the main base for the open lowland ecosystem. As I said, there are a large number of experts involved. Each expert or each indicator is connected to an expert on that indicator who is responsible for adding data into a database. This database might look slightly different between different indicators, where there are predefined indicator areas for which values are added for each indicator. Here's just an example of one of the counties, or this is actually a former county now. It's merged with another one in Norway, for which values are given for an indicator. This area represents a set of municipalities, and the municipality is the lowest possible resolution for the data that feed into the Nature Index database. So in some cases, data are actually provided for each municipality, but quite often they're provided like this for a county, including several municipalities. So, yeah, I can just jump back. As you see in the table to the left, there are values for a set of years, but they're also on the top there in that table, and there is a row called reference. So that's the values that correspond to a reference condition. It's intact nature for each indicator. So those are provided for each indicator in order to scale all indicator values or indicator data to a common scale from 0 to 1, where 1 represents the reference condition of intact nature.
Simon, could I please ask you to speak up a little bit, because the volume is fluctuating. You're sometimes difficult to hear. I'm so sorry.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I try to speak up a bit. The scaling is made to get indicators on a common scale from 0 to 1, where 1 represents the reference condition of intact nature, and 0 most often correspond to the absence of an indicator, or not the indicator, but absence of a species, for example, resulting in 0 of the indicator value. And to aggregate these indicators into aggregated indices, there are several parts of a weighting process. One of the most important ones is the functional group weighting. So the figure here shows that to the left is the proportion of indicators in different functional groups, but the weighting is done such that each functional group or trophic level represent or is given equal weight. But as you see, the orange part here is 50%. And that's a set of indicators that have been identified as key indicators, especially important for each X system. And these count to 50% of the total index. This is how it looked like for the last update, concerning which trophic levels are represented by the dataset. And as you can see, it varies a lot between the X systems. The weighting process also takes into account the area. And that includes the area covered with data, also the area of the station unit consideration, and the area of the X system. And after weighting indicators into aggregate indices, the index is reported, and well, during in these reports has been produced so far. It's been reported for Norway and main big regions in Norway. As I mentioned, data are provided at municipality level, so there's large potential to increase resolution also on the reporting, but that requires that data are also provided, or more indicators are provided with data with higher spatial resolution. So in summary, it looks like more or less like this. Different kinds of data fed into a database, including values for reference condition, or reference values for each indicator. These are scaled to a common scale, 0 to 1, and weighted aggregation process calculates different types of indices for each X system based on function groups, trophic levels, and the area data. So just to give you a glimpse of the results from last year's update, I will show you 3 X systems. You can find a lot more information as well as the complete results at the website here. But just briefly, we showed that in the last update, nature index of forests in Norway is very low, mainly as a consequence of very low indicator values for example, presence of old trees in the forest and deadwood. But we do see a slight increase in the last 10 years, which is promising. The alpine environments, or the mountain X system, show a quite weak negative trend since the start of the nature index. Due to a few certain species, there are also some species that show positive trends, of course. But this is the overall trend for the mountain system. Most dramatic decline is seen for the open lowland ecosystem, mainly represented by semi-natural ecosystems. And yeah, as probably most of you know, it's due to the abandonment of low intensity management of these ecosystems. So what is the Norwegian Nature Index used for in practice, except for delivering these reports, of course? Well, as it gives an overview of the state and trends of indicators and ecosystems in Norway, it highlights critical target points for nature conservation. Although I want to say that it is really an overview, so to actually take management actions, it's usually more information, detailed information on specific areas, specific ecosystems and indicators needed for taking these actions. Nature Index is used for reporting on national and international environmental goals. And also, except for like the standard index for an ecosystem, aggregating all the indicators, different thematic indices have been developed to focus on particularly important management relevant questions. And lately, it's been used to assess the condition of biodiversity within the index-based ecological condition assessment in Norway. This is a ecosystem condition framework very similar to the SEEA framework, slightly different but very similar. And this is, as biodiversity is one of the characteristics in there, the nature index is used to assess the condition of that characteristic.
Welcome everyone. I'm going to present the next 20 minutes or so on the construction of the experimental biodiversity account for the Netherlands for the period of 2006 to 2013, and that this was still based on the previous version of the handbook, and that has been worked by not only by myself but also of many colleagues of Statistics Netherlands, especially those of the Nature Statistics Department, and we also collaborated with the Dutch Butterfly Conservation Society. So we already seen in Steve's presentation that there are a lot of biodiversity indicators. Some of them are proposed by CBD. And we recommend to look at the extent of ecosystems, to look at abundance and distribution, threatened species, but also genetic diversity. Next to that, there were recommendations in the SEEA handbook to develop biodiversity accounts based on the extent of ecosystems, on species richness, if you have that information, and if you have even more information, perhaps also on abundance. Well, in the talk of today, I'm going to focus on a couple of these elements. I'll give you some examples of what we've done on extent, on threatened species. I spent some more time on how to account for species abundance. And finally, some slides on spatial approach, which also focused on diversity, the issue that Steve was also mentioning. Well, the main approach in developing these accounts is not that we from Statistics Netherlands go into the field and count animals or plants or so on. Some of us do, but that's in our spare time. But instead, we use a lot of data from operational monitoring networks and some additional data from citizen science projects, but mostly the validated observations from that. And one of the main tasks for the statistical offices is then to wrangle that data into the molds provided by SEEA. Well, one example then, of course, is the ecosystem extent account, in which all the different ecosystems are being recognized and measured in terms of area and for over a time interval, the changes in extent from one ecosystem type to another. But this is part of biodiversity because it represents the ecosystem level of biodiversity. But at the same time, there's a strong overlap with extent accounting. So I will not go into details on this. No. So let's move on to threatened species accounts. In the Netherlands, we approach this by means of the red lists of species. There are about 20 species groups for which red lists are developed, and each of the species in these groups is classified as endangered, extinct, vulnerable, etc. So this is the same procedure as being used in many countries. However, if we look at how that data is being collected and being published in the official government gazette, we see that it's quite irregular. So in 2005, for all the species groups, these red list status was established. But after that, it's only in scarce intervals, which are not aligned for the different species groups. Which makes sense because there's a lot of work, but for the type of structural accounting that we like to do for SEEA, then it poses a bit of problem. So basically what happens then is that our colleagues from the nature statistics department, they have all the raw data of measurements of the abundance of these species, and then apply the rules for which the red list status is determined every year. So it's kind of a virtual red list then. And that data can be then result in time series. And basically there are two approaches taken there. They look at the number of species which are on the red list, the endangered categories of the red list, and so that's called the red list length. And you see that here on top. But what also matters is the level of threat, and that's called the red list color. So if it's more threatened, then that color increases, more red, so to say. But in order to convert that type of information towards an account, we made a classification of all the transitions over an accounting period. You can see that here on the left. So if a species in the starting year has been vulnerable, but over a couple of years later it's not threatened anymore, and basically it's removed from the red list. So for all these transitions from one class to another, we can assign a type of category that is linked to the rows in accounting tables. So if you fill that in with all the numbers of the different species in these grid boxes, then we are able to construct a proper threatened species account following the suggestions made in the SEEA manual. So that's one way to do this. And the next few examples focus on the abundance changes. The main method used in the Netherlands is the construction of the Living Planet Index. Originally, that was proposed by the World Wildlife Fund, and this is calculated for many countries. But in the Netherlands, we calculated using our own data. And in the end of the day, you have plots like this, where you have, in this case, an overall living planet index, which is very slowly evolving over time. Although there are lots of interannual variation, and we have to say something about what happens in an accounting period, indicated here in gray. So, but let's first look how this is being constructed. As I mentioned, we use a lot of data from the formal ecological monitoring. It's called the network ecological monitoring. And it consists of, there are a lot of NGOs in the Netherlands which focus one species group. So there's the bird conservation, the butterfly conservation, and so on. And they all have a lot of volunteers who go into the fields every week or a few weeks to count birds or butterflies on very specific locations. So it's not just a random spatial sample, but these locations were carefully selected, and this whole setup is quality monitored by Statistics Netherlands. And that results in very high quality data sets of abundance per species per site. But yeah, even then, there are still a lot of gaps in that type of data sets. So here you see a small example of for skylarks, which have about slightly more than 50 sites. And here over time, you see all the gray boxes are missing data. In this case, it's quite severe, but there is always missing data because sometimes volunteers are ill or something like that. But you need to fill in this complete data set. So in the Netherlands, colleagues have developed a method to impute that data set by applying a Poisson regression model to the observed abundances, and that helps in completing the whole data set. And once the data is available, you can construct time series of the total number of total abundance numbers of one species over time. It's not total population; it's only the number of individuals within the monitoring network. And in this case, also uncertainty is taken into account. You see that here on top. And here on bottom, this small line is then the actual number of observed individuals. So the remainder is estimated by the model, the imputation model. Okay, next step is then to normalize it with respect to a starting year. And then to aggregate information on many species. And for that, our colleagues have constructed a whole methodology to do this multi-species aggregation. We're not going to detail that, but this is all being published and also referred to in our accounts. You can read it later if you like. And the end result of that step is then that multi-species abundance indicator, the living planet index. As I mentioned, it still varies quite significantly from year to year, right? Although there is some overlying a longer term trend. So, but if we make accounts, it's often for a very specified time interval. So in this case, 2006 to 2013. So then the question is, how do we give some meaning to the changes in LPE over the time interval? One way to do is to just put into account the value of the starting year and the value of the ending year. But because of this quite significant interannual variation, because of weather changes and so on, that might give a false impression, because those two individual years can indicate a decline, while in reality there is an increase, or vice versa. So it's much more wise to smooth out these fluctuations and to look at the underlying trends. And for that, we use the same methodology as has been used by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency for years. And they also have software for that called Trend Spotter, based on common filtering. And based on that methodology, you can either then look at what the overall slope would be within the accounting period, and taking that uncertainty and interannual variation into account. Or you can look at the smoothed values at the starting and ending point of the accounting periods, also taking the uncertainty into account. So in this case, both indicators say it has been stable during this period. Okay. Now this is the overall Living Planet Index for all species groups, for all environments. But of course, you can look into more detail, because the whole network has been set up in such a way that different habitats are represented, and different species groups are in this. And so we can look at, for instance, here examples for amphibians, for birds, butterflies, dragonflies, etc. And you see also that in most cases, these two indicators of what happens within the accounting period agrees. For mammals, both the slope and the net change are positive. But in this case, for amphibians, here you see that the overall slope is negative during the period. But if you compare even the smoothed values of the starting and the ending year, it has been stable. So there are still some issues here to be solved. Here's the same, but done for different ecosystem types. And for reference, I've put the overall LPE indicator here in gray. And yeah, so you see that there's a strong difference between different environments. Overall, there's a decline in the agricultural area, coastal dunes, heathlands and urban areas, but mostly wetlands are doing very well. And because of the large number of species involved here, and the fact that the overall LPE is unweighted, this results in a rather strong effect on the overall LPE. So that is still something that we discuss with the nature statistics group who make these indicators. To what extent this weighting is something that should be done or not. So once we have this type of information, we can put it into accounts. In this case, it's an example where we organize the information in a rather nested approach. So we start with all the terrestrial and freshwater nature, and then we can zoom in on terrestrial and nature only, and on different environments, and then see where we have changes which are really significant or not. Alternative approach is not looking at measured abundances and then taking the start year of our new nature policy being 1990 as a reference, but using the original pristine quality as a reference. A bit similar to what happens with the Norway nature index approach. So in this case, and that's called the mean species abundance. That's a method being used by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency mainly, also for global applications, for which is perhaps more applicable than within the Netherlands itself. And of course, we also try to integrate both approaches into integrating tables to see if they agree or not, and why not. Okay, the next few minutes I will devote to a spatial approach, basically based on occupancy modeling. In the maps I showed in the beginning of the presentation, it looks quite dense, but not of course not every square kilometer has been sampled. So what our colleagues did was collect all these monitoring data, appended with citizen science observations, and then construct spatial models, which also try to account for the phenomenon that species can be present somewhere but are not always detected, at least not every time that you visit there. So this is called the occupancy modeling. The underlying techniques I will not go into details here, but basically at the end it results in maps of species either being present or not within a grid cell for a specific year. And you can combine them to construct the maps for species diversity for all these groups. And of course, the amount of coverage depends between well-monitored species such as butterflies and less monitored species like mice from our pellets. But the interesting thing is that you can also then only select species which are characteristic for a certain habitat, or in this case it's for heathland, and then compare the diversity of heathland specific butterflies, that's here on the bottom, with the distribution of heathland itself. And then you see there's quite a good bottom here in red, you have the high diversity of these heathland butterflies, but also in some areas where you don't have any heathland, you still have these butterflies, and that's colored here in blue. Well, one of the reasons why you have these blue spots is because basically a lot of these butterflies also like to live in coastal dunes. So you see the same image, coastal dunes, like a mirror. On the other hand, if we look at forest and forest specific butterflies, then we see that the large expanses of forest here in the center of the country, you don't have a lot of a high diversity in forest butterflies. And we can see why that is in the next few slides, because we also try to link this type of information to the spatial structure of the landscape. Because there is, of course, a difference between this type of forest on the left and here on the right, where small patches of forest are much more intertwined with agricultural landscape, giving a bocage type of landscape. And usually in your extent account, you won't see this because you only see the total acreages of forest and meadows, but not how it is spatially organized. So you can do that by just measuring all the transitions between, in this case, grassland and forest grid cells. I put that information into tables and then try to construct indicators for that. So in this case, here on top, you see this map of the diversity of forest-specific butterflies. Here on the bottom, you see then the indicator based on that spatial analysis, where you measure the probability that forest pixels border another forest pixel. So that measures the areas where you have a lot of large forests. That's in the center of the country. So that doesn't look like the top images. But on the other hand, if you try to measure the hotspots where you have borders between forest and cropland, or forest and grassland, that's on the right, and then you see then some areas pop up, such as the eastern of the country and the southern of the country, which are exactly the locations where you have these hotspots of forest butterfly diversity, meaning that these are not really forest butterflies, but much more forest border butterflies, which makes sense also from a butterfly perspective. And similarly, we can look at what happens in the agricultural area. And using that analysis of what happens in the landscape, you can identify hotspots where you have large monocultures of either croplands on the left or grasslands here in the center, and then try to see if these also pop up on this map of the relative species richness of agricultural specific butterflies. And there you see the light spots here in the center of the country. They correspond to the areas where you have these vast expanses of peatland meadows. Usually it's called the green heart of the Netherlands, but well, it looks green, but you will not have a lot of agricultural butterflies, and it's the same in some other areas. Okay, to conclude, well, if you would like to do this type of accounts, then well, it's easy to start with just extent accounting, because that will already give you the tier 1 biodiversity accounts, being ecosystem extent and diversity. If you have a good amount of expert knowledge and some observations, you can do the tier 2 biodiversity accounting with species diversity and extinction risk. But you really need some monitoring programs to get reliable data on abundance in order to do this tier 3 accounting on trends in abundance. And it's not official tier 4, but let's say that you have real a dense monitoring network and combine it with some species distribution modeling. There are some risks associated with that, but okay, and that will allow you to do this high resolution spatial analysis. So, okay, what to do next now? Because we still have some filling from MAIA in order to follow up on this. Well, one issue that we should really look at is that how to define the trend detection during an accounting interval. I mentioned that there are still some issues over there to give a very definitive assessment of what happens, because ideally you just want one assessment if one biodiversity indicator is going up or down or stays the same during an accounting period. And the second task that we are working on is to enhance the spatial work that I've been presenting. So by linking the spatial biodiversity indicators to landscape structures, and we'll try to link that to the beta component of biodiversity, which relates species diversity on a large scale to that on smaller scales, on the side scale, and that in turn can be linked to policy relevant issues like the rise of habitat generalists and at the same time decline of habitat specialists. So, but we will be working on that over the next few months. And that was it. Thank you.
Well, I, for one, am very impressed, Patrick, by your presentation. Many thanks. It's really great. And I think now we can have some discussion. And Claire, I think please take charge of the discussions.
Yes, so thanks, Simon and Steve and Patrick. There's no questions in the chat at the moment, but I'm wondering if someone might like to take the floor with any questions. We had quite a variety of information presented to us just then. A good overview from Steve, and then how Norway is tackling it with their nature index. Hello, did someone want to come in?
Well, if I may then ask the first question, just to give other people also some time to think, because I'm really, I got very enthusiastic of the presentation by Patrick, and every time Patrick is presenting, there's something new, it seems. Patrick, it seems to me that for the first time now we have information on biodiversity that's so detailed that we can say, look, if we want to conserve species or if we want to intervene in the landscape in order to enhance the population of a certain species, yeah, we come to the point that we have understanding on how to do that. For example, in the Netherlands, there's the idea of planting some trees to sequester carbon. Personally, I think that we're such a small country and trees don't grow that fast that if you want to kind of justify investing in planting trees only for carbon sequestration, really it doesn't add up. But if you can combine that with enhancing biodiversity or enhancing recreation, then it makes already a lot more sense. And with the data that we're having now, at least for butterflies and maybe some other species, actually we're starting to get to that point. Patrick, would you agree with that, or what do you think?
Yeah, excellent question, Lars. Yes, I partly agree in the sense that on the national scale, we can see this impact. As shown by the example of relating landscape structure to the agricultural specific butterflies, you see a relationship between those, and that can be used also to support that policy. But on a very small scale, it will be much more difficult because, especially a lot of agricultural policies like regenerative agriculture happens on a farm scale or in a field scale, and then you would like to compare what happens on that field with fields just a few hundred meters away, and that is not going to be resolved by this type of data. And also the data is looks impressive, but it's not fit for that application yet, because most of these measurements are not on the farms. But that is changing at this moment because there's also the development of very specific farmland biodiversity indicators, partly also sponsored by the dairy industry in the Netherlands, and in collaboration with Butterfly Conservation Society, they are starting now to monitor butterflies also on the farms themselves. So that will give also opportunities to do that type of analysis.
Thank you, Patrick.
David hand up, and I've got some questions from the chat.
Yeah, great, thanks. I'm sorry I wasn't able to find out how I sent the question to everyone, so I sent it privately to the presenters. I apologize for that. But I had a question for Stephen. In your and by the way, I'm also extremely inspired by all three presentations, so thank you to all of you. Question to Stephen. You mentioned that, and Lars also introduced the biodiversity accounts as possibly the only place, or at least the place where non-use values are emphasized in the SEEA. And given the importance of non-use values, I wondered whether in biodiversity accounts as well, there's a stronger argument for using welfare-based valuation and also putting these in bridging tables, as chapter 12 says in the guidelines. So really the question is biodiversity accounts the place in SEEA where welfare values would be most appropriate to compare with exchange values? I guess that's my question. Thanks.
Thank you for that, David. I think it's a great question and got me thinking, really. I think, you know, definitely what we're looking at with biodiversity accounting is organising the underlying biophysical information, at least, so that we got the right indicators that are communicating on what's happening to those aspects of biodiversity that we do place a large non-use value on. And I think it's very clear that these types of welfare values are very important to public decision making and policy makers. So I think in the context of accounting for biodiversity, one would want to present those types of welfare values within the broad package of analytical materials, if you like, that you delivered to decision makers. And I think it would be very interesting then to look at the differences that emerge when taking on this welfare based value perspective to those that just come out of the normal ecosystem services accounts, because there is obviously, as you're identifying, a real danger that something gets missed here in our decision making that leads to, broadly what is an economically inefficient outcome, but really it's a bad social welfare income. So I think it should certainly be in the package of materials. I'm not quite sure how technically it's resolved and integrated into the whole framework. Hope that's just my thoughts on it.
Thanks, Steve. A question for Simon. Could you elaborate on the data quality required for successful index calculation? It's someone's recalled that they tried to apply the method in Bulgaria and it was unsuccessful, possibly due to incomplete data.
Yes, well, it's quite hard to answer very specific, but as the question implies, the index calculation, of course, requires that there is good data to calculate index. Well, we have noticed, for example, that not having good indicator coverage across these trophic levels, for example, or having just, let's say, one indicator for top predators, while there are many top predators, for example, that will not make a good index calculation, of course. But then, like, more mathematically, it's of course possible, even with less or worse data. It's a bit hard to answer. I guess it's what I can say is that there's a lot of work done by the experts involved, and they've tried to boil this down to an indicator set that is representative for what we aim for with the nature index, and yeah. But of course, I think it touches on an important aspect that without good data will not be a good index. And I can say that when we report on this, we try to focus on how does the nature index actually mirror what we know about the state in nature, or what we know from other types of aggregated measures, similar to what Patrick presented, for example. So it's important to not just take the index value and use it and without thinking. But I think that relates. Is it okay if I continue? Because I got another private question from David.
Sure, please continue.
Yeah, which is related to that. So David Barton asked, to what extent does reporting on trends in nature index take into account confidence levels? He noticed that he couldn't see any confidence intervals in the figure for forest ecosystem, for example. And does policymakers take into account these confidence intervals if used actively in decision making? So yes, we connect uncertainty to the index, of course. The reason for that we didn't see any confidence intervals for forests is, of course, that forest is ecosystem where there are most indicators, good data coverage, especially from the National Forest Inventory, resulting in a low confidence interval, simply. Whether or not policymakers or the managers sector or policymakers actually make use of these, it's a bit hard to answer, but that's something that we that have been involved in this try to be very try to communicate that there are uncertainties linked to these index calculations, not only to the aggregated index, but also to individual indicators, and that is important to keep in mind when interpreting this. So, yeah.
Thanks, Simon. Patrick, I'll call on you now. There's been a couple of questions for you around measuring presence and absence of species, and how to incorporate minimal viable populations and fragmentation and so forth into the accounts, and have you done that?
Yeah, excellent. That is an important issue, I think. I don't know. I don't have an answer at this moment. Right. But I'm going to ask the people who do this spatial modeling, because it's mainly in there, because those are present or absent values, in order to see to what extent that can be extended to include this notion. But of course, it does require that we have some understanding on how large that minimum viable population would be, right? I'm not sure if we can do that. But on the other hand, this is exactly the reason why the inclusion of abundance data in biodiversity accounting is so important. Because I know in the also in the preparation for the new SEEA manual, we had some discussions on that, because in many countries they don't have abundance data, so you have information on which species are there. So species or biological diversity in general and species diversity in special is then perhaps too often reduced also to species richness, and just the diversity in species. But if you only have a few token individuals of a species, that doesn't mean anything. So that's also why abundance is relevant, because using that you can see monitor the decline of species, because a lot of biodiversity policies also aim at conservation of that biodiversity, which includes to have healthy populations. So partly, yeah, so good question. I don't have the exact answer yet, but going to look that into that.
Steve, did you want to come in with to further that complement that?
Just a very quick one to add onto what Patrick said, and partly in a response to a question that came from Cremina around capacity accounts. And I think, you know, there's an important role for these abundance measures that's pretty well established through the SEEA central framework in understanding what the stocks of species are, as a way of understanding what maximum sustainable yields might be. And there's, you know, a clear relationship there to what is an appropriate level of sort of provisioning ecosystem services to use from an ecosystem that can be supported by these information on abundance. That was it, really.
Thanks, Steve. We have a question here from Catherine Farrell, and it's about how have the potential end users reacted to the biodiversity accounts in the different case studies presented? So you've put the accounts together and then presented it. How have the end users reacted to that information? Simon, Patrick, Steve, anyone want to take it first?
Yeah, in our case, as I mentioned, most of the information comes from already running monitoring programs, and even the course of the Living Planet Index indicators are all already being published. So they were already being used in policy development. And when I also spoke to the people who make them about our inclusion into the accounts, they were a bit skeptic on what the use of the accounts would be for nature policy, because they already make use of the the raw indicators. Yeah, and what we have done is then taken that information and put it into the same framework as all the other information on ecosystem assets, including ecosystem services. So, but we're still working on presenting that whole integrated picture to policy makers. And so these applications we will focus on in the next few months as well. Yeah.
Thanks. Simon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, well, sure. I can just mention that, the process with Norwegian Nature Index has been a project together with a Norwegian Environmental Agency. So it's been a close collaboration with policymakers. Then there are, of course, other end users than them. And I think there's been quite a lot of discussion during the years in Norway, like who will use Nature Index and how. And it comes down often to this with the limitations linked to resolutions, spatial resolutions. Of course, each municipality would like to have their own index with perfect data behind. It's not possible currently. And then, of course, it's a bit of a conflict area. I guess other types of or similar types of projects also have experienced, I mean, presenting an index stating that the condition of forests is bad, for example. It's not popular in the forestry sector, just to put it simple examples. Yeah, that's how it is. And here we're talking about the intrinsic values, and that's the purpose of the index to show. So, yeah.
Thanks.
And just on the Uganda example with the sort of sheer butternut tree suitable habitat. Obviously, this was a bit of an issue, loss of that habitat in Uganda anyway, which is kind of what drove us to look at it through the accounting kind of lens. But there was a decision really to try and conserve some of those trees following a couple of years, after the accounts were developed. I think it was part of the weight of evidence that contributed to that decision. By no means it was the only piece of information, but one of the issues was that the accounts were identifying potentially, the areas that could support this tree and the sheer butter value chain. But one of the issues those ecosystems were experiencing was really around converting trees into charcoal rather than realizing the sustainable harvesting opportunities. So a lot of the protection was geared towards protecting the species from that kind of fate.
Thanks. So yes, a different, the accounts are being used differently by different groups depending on how bought in they are, sounds like, to the underlying data and indicators as well. Another question here on how imbalanced is the data in the data sets that you're using in the accounts? I mean, Simon's touched on this already. And does it have an impact on the accounts, putting them together? Patrick, in the Netherlands, do you have perfect data?
I wish. Yeah. I think that there are two issues. I think the data that is being collected is perfectly suitable for the type of applications for which these networks were designed. To monitor the quality of nature areas, to support nature policy. So, but now we see that the policy development, there is a lot of attention for the interaction between biodiversity and, for instance, agriculture or recreation, yes, because of the European Green Deal, regenerative agriculture, so make more use of ecosystem services, in agriculture, and on the other hand, the negative impact of intensive agriculture on surrounding biodiversity of surrounding natural ecosystem assets. So there is not, I would say there's not enough data to support that type of applications, because the lack of measurements in less attractive sites on agricultural fields and so on. So that should perhaps change. At least there is an imbalance there. And there's also an imbalance with respect to the type of species that are involved. For instance, a lot of ecosystem within SEEA, we have now adopted the IUCN global ecosystem typology, right? Because part of the revision process was also to have a more functional view on ecosystems and the way they operate, and so based on nutrient cycling and so on, and other ecological processes. So a lot of this will also depend on what's happened in the soil, right? And soil biota and soil biodiversity are those key for the functioning of ecosystems, and therefore ecosystem condition and the provision of ecosystem services. But we have very little data on soil biodiversity in the Netherlands, but also throughout Europe. It is changing a bit. Yesterday, I was also attended on, there's this European project, Lucas, which I always thought was on land use, on using a regular grid throughout Europe. But there is also a lot of soil properties being measured there. And as we speak, we're analyzing all these samples for soil biodiversity as well. So, but in general, I think both in with respect to biodiversity, but also in ecosystem services, there is a lack of attention to soils. So that's another imbalance. Thank you.
Thanks. I've got another question here. It's to all presenters, and it's from David Barton at Nina. And so basically what he wants to know is, what are your concluding thoughts about what to communicate from biodiversity accounts relative to condition accounts? And to whom should we be focusing SEEA, EA, thematic account messaging, given that the species monitoring data is already published by and for the conservation sector? So who are we doing the biodiversity accounts for, fundamentally? Are we still talking to the conservation community? Or are we trying to talk a bit broader than that? I'm going to ask Steve to come in first, because I know you've been thinking about this.
That's a really good one. And yeah, we really are now trying to get outside of the the environmental sector. I think a very core purpose of the ecosystem accounting framework generally is getting to national planners, development decision makers, finance ministries, really making strong economic and social cases for investment in biodiversity, ecosystem-based adaptation, nature-based solutions, ecosystem services supply to a whole host of actors that are well outside the conservation community normally.
Thanks, Steve. Patrick or Simon, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, on a general level, I think the main reason why we do this is to see how nature in the broad sense is related to society and economy. Yeah, so the implications of the accounts are both to track how much use is being made of nature, but also if that is sustainable or not. And all these elements were in the excellent diagrams shown by Steve, of course. But the value is really in the integration, because you have all the different types of information available in order to support this very difficult decision and policy making on what we do with our landscape and with nature and so on. Yeah.
Simon, anything else to add from the Norwegian perspective?
No, not really. I think both Steve and Patrick summarized it quite well.
Okay. Great, thank you. So I'm just looking down my list. Another question for you, Steve. Seasonality can have an impact on when you monitor for biodiversity. How do the accounts take that into consideration, and if so, how would that be handled?
I think this is quite important. I think it's not just within a year variation, it's between variation, and it's important that this is smooth. But I think Simon and Patrick will be better placed to technically respond to this.
Patrick, or Simon, how do you handle seasonality in your work?
Seasonality.
Or fluctuations between years.
What were you saying, Claire?
Or even fluctuation between the years and seasons. How do you handle that?
Yeah, well, fluctuations between the seasons, that is being taken care of by the way these monitoring programs are set up. For some species, it's measured every couple of seasons and then also converted to annual numbers first. Yeah, or there is an inclusion of a season factor also in the imputation model. So that is included. And for butterfly monitoring also, because the first step is also to establish a kind of curve of abundance throughout the year, because these are being measured every week because of the short life span. So seasonality is perfectly taken care of. And well, interannual variability. Well, as I mentioned, we think that this smoothing approach will be appropriate there, because otherwise, especially during short periods, otherwise you will be comparing, for instance, a lousy year with a lot of rainstorms in summer with a year with nice weather, and don't see the underlying trends. So, but there was also a question by David Barton on if that smoothing does not result in some problems if you have sudden changes into in abundance. Yeah, it's a good question, of course. Well, I have not looked into it yet, but maybe there is some hope that it can be captured. If it's not too sudden, it can be captured by that smoothing, because it's not a mathematical smoothing like a loose or lowest curve that you can use in a lot of plotting software, such as what happens in ggplot, for those of you who are familiar with that. So, but it's more based on a state space approach with common filters. So, at least in theory, it should be able to pick that up, but I have not tested that. But on the other hand, a lot of this data processing is automated, right? Because all the abundance data is put into databases first, and then extracted, and then feeds through all the analysis software in automated fashion. But I'm a very strong opponent of treating that system as black box, and then feeding data in on one side, and then getting accounts out at the other side without understanding what is going on, because things like this can happen. So, but the nice thing about using everything with computer programs and scripts, like, because most of our processing is with R, and you can easily put out curves for each individual species, for instance. The abundance plots, and put them into like a PDF document of 500 pages. And then you can look through that in order to see if there are strange things going on there, which you should look into. So it is easy then to spot the impacts of events that you have not taken into account in your methodology. Yeah, thanks.
Simon, do you have anything to add there, or I'll go to our next question?
Well, I can just shortly. It's the same for the Nature Index Norway, that seasonality is taken care of for individual indicators. So I mean, the values that are reported into the database for Nature Index are already taken into account the seasonality aspect, and that's specific for different indicators, of course. And then with the interannual variation, it will, of course, be quite a problem for a 5-year reporting procedure. But for those, especially many Arctic species, these fluctuating trends, example lemmings, and then the indicator itself is actually, well, it's defined as the number of peak years, a bit simplified, but the number of peak years within a certain period. And then that is the index value that is imported for a given year within this 5-year time frame. So yeah, that's one way, another way of dealing with it.
Okay, thank you, Simon. We have another question here. All your examples have focused on reporting significant trends. Should we also be reporting on increases in variance over time and variance exceeding viable population levels and habitat conditions? I think the answer is yes, but do we, and do we have a way of doing that at the moment? Everyone's well.
Yep. No, we don't do that. It's an excellent suggestion, I would say. As far as I also understand that tracking variance over time is one way to identify if a population is approaching a tipping point, right? So there is some theory on it. Yeah. So it will be good to do that indeed. Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah, just to follow up, I agree with Patrick there, and I think one of the things sort of conscious of within the accounting model is everything's linear. You're on sort of linear paths of improvement and decreases, and acknowledging that, you know, ecological systems aren't actually like that. You have irreversibilities, you have tipping points, thresholds, issues like this that we do need to manage in a way that we have safe kind of operating spaces around. So I think, yeah, something does need to be integrated into that.
Thanks, Steve. Simon, did you have anything else to add, or anything else? Okay, great. I've got no more questions. Does anyone who hasn't posted a question and would like to say something, or even just make a reflection, have something to say? I'm just looking to just put your hand up if you do, or you want to come in. Because we're almost to the end here. We've only got a few more moments.
I'll just pick up on something. I think it was from Catherine, which was around this issue that obviously the conservation groups have been struggling for a long time to get the kind of issues that we're talking about today on the agenda. And I think the question is really, you know, how does the SEEA EA make a tangible difference to getting these issues really into development planning and decision making? For me, I think there's two aspects to it, and maybe speaking a bit too much on Patrick's behalf here, but the role of the statistical office and the data quality assurance frameworks that they deploy, and the data quality assurance as an objective party, I think really does help to get these kind of data and issues into lots of different sectoral planning processes, builds trust in the signals that they're sending. I think that's an important part of it. I also think, you know, the adoption of the SEEA EA really makes an important opportunity to very directly link ecosystem assets, species, the services supplied by ecosystems through to economic units that are represented in the national accounts, and so that means that, you know, ecosystems can be linked to some of the very well established economic planning models and processes that are done. And I think another part of that now is that the perspective of just looking at environmental inputs into the formal economy is now officially expanded to also, you know, consider within the national accounts the importance of ecosystems for regulating and cultural services. So I think it gives us a much more broader base for sort of formal economic planning. So, you know, I'm very hopeful that this will really make a very tangible difference.
Great, thanks, Steve. There's final words there. Any final words or thoughts from you, Patrick? And then I'll ask Simon the same question.
No, but I was also reading a question by Rob van der Veren, report in the Netherlands, on the risks of combined indicators. And because also in SEEA there is now the in chapter 5 on condition, there is this trend to do aggregation towards to end up with a single condition indicator. But there are some real, and the point made by Rob, if I read it correctly, is that there is the risk that it will be quite low, because at least if you use the same type of thinking as being used in the European Water Framework Directive, where it's basically one out, all out. And that will give then a very negative signal to the public that no matter what we do, it will still be in a lousy condition. And I partly agree with that. First off, because you have an enormous loss of information if you do aggregation. And second, because of this negative impact also on this public interpretation of what actually happens with biodiversity. And so it will be important just to keep on presenting a large set of indicators, which are each of them are relatively easily understood and can be linked to something that the public can engage with, and try not to focus any on aggregation for aggregation's sake. And because also in general in economics, we're moving away from that direction, because there is a very strong policy now on this. There is this whole beyond GDP movement, right? And so in the part, anything economics was aggregated into the single number of BBP, but now we realize that there's so much more to welfare and well-being than that. So in a lot of countries, including the Netherlands, we are now constructing, we call it the monitoring of broad well-being, which we have a lot of beyond BBP measures. So it would be strange then if that's happening in the economy, that while in ecosystem accounting, we are trying to squeeze everything into a single number. Yeah.
Thanks, Patrick. Any final words from you, Simon, or have you?
Well, I can just add that I totally agree with Patrick, and any these kind of indices should be accompanied with more detailed information about single species, single indicators in this aggregation framework, and that's what we try to do in Norway, both for the Nature Index, presenting the state of each species or indicator, as well as the aggregated index. And also for the condition accounting we're working on. The visualization process there focus a lot on giving the overall picture, or not only the overall picture, but also visualizing the state and trends of different aspects of the aggregated index that we use, just to make sure it's not too simplified. So yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Steve, Patrick, and Simon, for answering questions, both technical and also on the communication element of your work, and for presenting as well. I think that brings us to the end. I'm just going to ask Lars if he would like to say any final words to close.
I don't have anything to say, Claire. I think it was a very interesting and very informative webinar. Thanks very much also from my side to the three speakers, and to yourself, of course, Claire, for moderating the discussion, and everybody that asked a question. So looking forward to see you at the next MAIA webinar.